Toi te ara puoru, SOUNZ.
E ngā reo, e ngā mana, rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. You're with the podcast Scoring It Her Way for SOUNZ Centre for New Zealand Music, Toi te Arapuaru. Ko Rebecca Blundell aho. I've pretty much always resisted separating out women composers as a group because my inclination is to say that every composer is different and their work will speak for itself. But in order for that to happen, that work has to be heard, and we have a really long history of silencing women's voices in Western music. And it's easy to assume that now it's suddenly okay, and that's a tempting thing to assume because I can go to concerts and I can hear successful New Zealand women composers' works being performed. But to avoid making the same mistakes as in the past, I think it's really important not to assume. We actually need to ask some composers questions about what the environment is like in New Zealand now. So I've got together a group of 4 New Zealand women composers with different experiences and backgrounds. Eve de Castro-Robinson, Mary Boynton, Claire Cowan and Ihlara McIndoe. And we're going to have a chat. If it sounds like we're not all in the same room, it's because we're not. It's a video call. I think it's pretty much impossible to get everyone in the same room at the moment. But I'll just start by getting each of you to introduce yourselves.
Kia ora koutou. Eve de Castro-Robinson. I'm a sort of late middle-aged. In fact, I turned 65 a couple of days ago, which puts me in a slightly different age bracket. And I've been in this sort of creative composing world for 40 years. And in terms of defining myself, I'm this kind of Pākehā, educated, late middle-aged, privileged sort of woman, mother, sound botherer, left-wing, bipolar Scorpio who strides around the place. And really, as I get older, I have more and more difficulty defining myself as anything, but other people seem to see me as a composer, so that'll do for now. I'm not particularly happy being called a woman composer. I don't think it occurs to any of us as women composers that we are particularly specially that, although I'm only talking for myself. I've always just forged on in my own way, and I'd rather just be a composer or a creative person.
Tēnā koutou, ko mere tokarahi Boynton ahau, no te taira whiti, ko te atanga i ko Ngāti Oneone, ko tūhoi hoki ōku iwi. I am the director Ngā Toi Māori for Tāwhiri, which is an umbrella group for different art platforms like the Aotearoa New Zealand Festival of the Arts and the Wellington Jazz Festival and other things we might like to make. I first came into this space with learning Gillian Whitehead's work, Awaherea. And that's when I first met Eve de Castro-Robinson at a women's composing festival in the 90s. And we had that at the Wellington Town Hall, and I was just studying opera at that time. In terms of my own composition, I really have just been in the area of writing lyrics. But now I have been asked to compose a waiata. And so that's a new challenge for me, is to bring the rangi with the kupu.
Kia ora everyone, I am Claire Cowan and I am a composer mainly in a collaborative sense. I write soundtracks. I love working with other people from different musical backgrounds. I have a band which is sort of on an extended hiatus at the moment, but it's usually a large kind of unwieldy group of musicians from different backgrounds playing covers that are reimagined of some of my favourite music from all different genres. I started studying instruments when I was young, and then I studied composition with Eve and John Elmsley at Auckland University. And then after that, I sought out collaborations with other creative practitioners like filmmakers, just anything and everything that was diverse to keep me entertained in making music.
Kia ora koutou, my name's Ihlara. I'm from Ōtepoti, Dunedin. I grew up and studied there at the University of Otago, learning from Anthony Ritchie and Peter Adams. I did a bit of performance and composition. Now I live in Wellington. I work as a lawyer and do as much music and composition as I can. And I think these conversations about the Aotearoa composition community and what it's like to be a composer and what it's like to be a composer who's not a man are really important conversations to be having, and really reflecting on these ideas of, I suppose, what we expect a composer to look like and sound like and behave like, and what our experiences are within that community.
I know that for Claire, at least, you had at least one woman teacher, whereas Ihlara, I think you had men. Do you think that made a difference to you?
I had male teachers who were really aware of the issues that exist in the lack of diversity in composition circles or the composition community in New Zealand. So I always felt supported and empowered by my teachers. But I think it was really obvious that, my first year at university, there were 2 women in my class of, 20, 25 students. And both of us remained in the program, so I think that does say something about how supported we felt. But the fact is that there were only 2 students who weren't male in that class to start with, and perhaps that does have something to do with seeing role models, but not just at an institution, university level, but I suppose in the outreach that happens at that early education stage as well.
Eve, what has your experience been over your career teaching? Did you find that there were equal numbers of men and women?
I think a couple of years ago I was asked by a couple of different places to do a tally, and luckily I had in the books, as it were, numbers, and over the past 8 years or so, the numbers are about a third female to male consistently. Women have been composing music forever, but it's how we hear about them or how they're made prominent, the Clara Schumann question. So compared with Ihlara's experience in Auckland, I think we probably had bigger cohorts. And so when I went through back in the 80s, I think there were plenty of us. And I didn't really even notice that I was a female. I had Dorothy Carr and Glenda Keem and Leonie and people like that who've kept composing. So that same ratio, I think, has probably kept going. It's what those women do with that, or what happens to them, that's the key thing, because women are all out there being creative, as we know.
And do you have a kind of anecdotal experience of how many people that you teach would go on to work as composers? I think you probably stay in touch with quite a few of them.
Yes, I do. Very few. And the people like Claire is a shining example. And, Juliet Palmer, who was more a sort of semi-contemporary of mine, Celeste Oram, more recently Linda Dallimore, this kind of person. And I think those people like Claire, it was very clear early on that they had the requisite inner resources, obviously talent, because you have to more or less have talent to get into a school of music, a drive and energy and drive and a bit of confidence. And you don't really have to teach them much, that they keep going. All the good ones you don't really have to do much apart from just guide them along.
I think I've heard you in an interview before say, you're not even sure how you teach composition, so that's kind of in line with that comment, I guess.
But none of us know that. But men may look as though they know how to better, as they do in a lot of areas. In the workplace at university, it's famously men will always go for a promotion slightly before they're ready, and women will always hang back. It's a well-known fact. And I think the same applies to most women composition students.
So Claire, since Eve was referencing you coming through and her experience teaching you, what was that like for you?
Well, when I first started university, I was really pleased to have a woman lecturer, and Eve was a breath of fresh air. I guess she was the first woman composer that I'd met. I also had Glenda Keem for harmony and Leonie Holmes as a tutor as well, so there was not just Eve. And I also love my male tutors and lecturers, so I was just happy to be amongst like-minded people and, exploring that whole world of composition.
Did you always know you were going to keep going?
Yeah. I think I do remember, maybe it was your first lecture, Eve, or maybe it was my second year that I actually had you. But we were in a small room with a lot of composers, and you said, put your hand up if you want to be a composer as a career choice. And a lot of people did, but then, by the third year and the fourth year, that had whittled down to 3 people. And of the 3 people who graduated in my year, I never heard from the other 2 again. I think a lot of people who study composition at uni never expect to make it a career because it's just something that they're passionate about, but they don't want to monetize. They don't want to make it something that they earn money from because that's not the pleasure part of it for them. For me, I kind of like the challenge of being able to write music for money and all the other psychological things that go with that, the networking with other people, trying to write music for somebody who doesn't know about music, creating soundtracks for films and stories that need to be reflected in the music and how that works alongside other people's artwork. So I also like writing music for myself, but now I find it harder and harder each time I'm given a commission and I have no boundaries and no rules. And somebody just says, we're going to pay you this much, you just write us a piece of music. I'll go, I don't know where to begin. So I've always liked that collaborative approach and working with other people, and I guess that marries up well with earning a living from it. So it's much harder to come by a full-time income from just commissions from tambo ensembles or orchestras or whatever.
Mary, we've been talking a little bit about kind of academia, I guess, so far, but one of the things I'm interested in knowing from you is you spent quite a lot of your career as an arts festival director, and especially bringing forward other Māori artists. And I wondered if you could give us an impression of what it's like for women who write music in te ao Māori.
Well, traditionally, women wahine Māori were the composers of our culture. So, times have changed, and there's a good mixture of wahine and tāne composing now. But really it was kind of the realm of wahine to compose waiata ngiri, waiata hangi, Aotearoa. It was a realm of wahine because that's the seat of emotion. But for Māori, composing has kind of existed more in the kaparaka space, Māori show bands, popular music. So in terms of contemporary classical music, that's not really a space that Māori have occupied in a big way. So, you know, the years that I've been involved, it's been kind of quite a lonely space because, you know, I was trained in classical music at the Conservatorium of Music here in Wellington, and always had a passion for te reo Māori and creating platforms for that. So I just naturally kind of fell into that space of collaborating with other composers like Arafah to bring te reo Māori and all of our tikanga and our kawa into that space. But I think that we're going to see a kind of major breakthrough in the next 10 years in terms of Māori composing. You see the work that Hene Wehi Mohi is doing with contemporary pop music and getting artists of today to translate a lot of their waiata into te reo Māori. In terms of traditional Māori composition, we're seeing a lot of young Māori coming through the kura kaupapa and kohanga reo, very, very well equipped in terms of writing in te reo Māori and composing in a traditional Māori style. Yeah, I'm very confident of the future for composition in te reo Māori. It just may not be through a Pākehā paradigm so much.
I want to ask you about that yourself, because I know you collaborated with Gareth Farr on Ngā Hihi o Matariki earlier this year with the NZSO, and you took a very traditional kind of Māori sound onto a stage with a Western orchestra, and I wondered what that was like for you.
It was tricky. And I'm not scared of performing with orchestras. No, actually, I lie. It's scary. It's a big taniwha. But, you know, it took a long time for me to find my comfort in composing within that space. And I really just had to dig down into a Māori space. So Ariana, Tikau and I spent quite a long time guided by Kali Meriari we'd had a lot of wānanga, and, you know, first and foremost were the kupu, and that defined what the kaupapa was going to be, what the story was. So it took a long time to find the narrative and the meaning. And from there, once we got the words down, got the story down, the narrative down, the melody came, and I spent time just listening to Motiatia and trying to find the right voice or the right reo.
Ihlara, it was a few days after that concert with Mary, I think, you had your work, Ephemeral Bounds, performed by the National Youth Orchestra and NZSO members. I was just wondering what your experience was like in putting together that work with the orchestra.
I was so fortunate to have that opportunity to work with the National Youth Orchestra. I think there's something about working with your peers that is really special, and having that collaboration and the rehearsal process of hearing it come to life and hearing them put their own interpretation and creativity to the work is really special. And so I found that a fantastic opportunity. And I think perhaps the one of the most valuable opportunities within that residency was working with Selena Fisher as my mentor, a composer that I really admire and love the work of. And I suppose just the conversations we could have about being a woman in composition and working with an orchestra and the politics and negotiation. And
Tell me more. What kind of things did you discuss?
I mean, I suppose the nature of working with this piece of history, this massive institution that is the orchestra, is a fantastic experience, but it's also caught up with this whole history of hierarchy and colonialism and tradition, and not just breaking from that, but challenging that, and at the same time preserving some aspects of that is, or at least of that art form and the amazing works that stem from the orchestra. Balancing that with what goals we might have as composers, trying to be a part of a uniquely Aotearoa music community, and how we go about that and working with institutions.
Does anyone else, like maybe Eve or Claire, have an experience related to working with an orchestra that kind of feeds into that idea? Because I think it could be very fraught. Like I know some of those players are really hesitant to try new things, and they're like, no, just want to play Mala. Have you felt that resistance?
Well, particularly way back, 40 years ago, whatever it was, I had an opportunity to work with the NZSO quite early on, and boy, I don't think it changes. They're still forbidding because they're a group and they're a hierarchical group, and they're all splayed across the stage looking neutral because they're at work. They're at work, and you come into their office, and there's usually a male conductor, and so it's sort of things are stacked up against you from the beginning. That's how I felt as a young person, and also as a composer, because you come in there and they're waiting. And I remember one occasion where I had to get up on the podium and talk about the piece and explain it in advance, and I just blanked. That's a bit unusual for me, because they were all looking at me expectantly, and I was suddenly put in a subservient position. It took me years to realise that actually they were bloody lucky to have this piece from me. And so, Ihlara, when I hear you say I was incredibly lucky, I remember my saying that same phrase all those decades ago in a listener interview. I feel incredibly, and that's not mimicking, I feel incredibly lucky to have this opportunity. They're lucky to have your piece. And not many males are heard to say, I feel incredibly lucky. So I think we're all of us, wahine, perhaps are guilty of that kind of over-modesty. Anyway, this is a slightly different issue, but that facing the orchestra and And I do remember a certain rhythm that I'd written in the brass players. There was sort of muttering amongst the brass players, which is a common occurrence. And because they've got it's a group ethic, because they're sitting in a collective, they can say whatever they like. You know, so it's that kind of power imbalance, and you're up there saying, no, I really want it to go ba 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 da da da. It's got easier over the years, but Claire, I mean, you'll have lots of experiences.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been working with orchestras since I was, 18, I think was the first time I got a piece played, and from that experience to how I work with an orchestra now has changed quite a bit. I guess just growing up and being more sure of myself and knowing the etiquette more. But it's always been, I think I've had a work conducted by a woman conductor once. That was Tiani. She was great. And the conductors I've worked with have also been awesome, all of the men conductors. But I guess they're the one person who should have your back if an orchestra member takes issue with the way that you've notated something, or a technique that you've asked them to do that's not very convenient, or stuff like that. And so I felt, I guess, maybe it's just how I am in any situation where I'm asking people to do things. I have a sort of learned way of trying to make friends with everybody, trying to make everybody like me, so that when I ask them to do things, they're a little bit more than what they're usually expected to do, or stuff like that. I have a relationship with more of these players now than when I did back then. I was just an unknown student composer. And that sort of rapport means that they want to do good for you, and they're looking forward to playing your next piece and stuff like that. And I think back when I entered a competition, that was how I got my first piece played, was a competition. And I think they selected finalists, and you got a reading, and then I remember some of the guys who were also in the competition were super confident straight from the bat. They'd tell the conductor straight away, the harp's out of time, and I was just like, you can't say that. You have to be so because performers are so self-conscious, and they don't want to be singled out. It's just, there's a whole lot of social stuff that goes with being a composer, having your work played, channels that you have to do through the conductor, at break times having a surreptitious word to, just a little sneaky aside, hey, that little violin solo, I think you're actually, that might be just one semitone, oh, you've missed that sharp, stuff like that. You have to, that's how my approach is to it. And I have a good working relationship with lots of people in lots of the orchestras, and I feel that that's the way that I've been able to build a career out of it. Make friends, and then the friends will work for you and want to do good by you. And same with orchestra management. You have to be polite and persistent, and I think confidence for me has come with growing up and realizing that the music that I write is useful to people and people like it, and all that stuff that can only really come with years of trial and error and learning, and that will go on for the rest of my career, I'm sure.
A lot of your work is in theatrical productions and also in film, and I wonder, those are also traditionally male areas, and how has it been working in those areas?
I started off working in theatre, mainly with physical theatre, soundtracks for small contemporary dance things, and then I started working with Red Leap Theatre Company. That's all female run, and the other dance productions were female choreographers. The first male choreographer I worked with was Lachlan Pryor, who I went on to write a ballet with the RNZB. Fantastic experience working with Lachlan, because he and I are good friends. in the TV world, I did commercials, I did telemovies, I did short films, and mostly male directors, but some females. And I think I don't think I've ever lost a job or not been asked to do a job because I'm a woman, but I feel like I've probably got jobs because I'm a woman. So I don't know if that makes me an anomaly, but I feel like women want to work with other women, and I've been brought into projects, I feel, as a token woman. And whether that makes everybody happy on a superficial level, fine, I got the gig, but I do feel a bit weird about it, you know. It should be about the music, and I know it's a marketing point for some people, like with the RNZB, I was the first female composer to write a ballet for a full-length ballet, which is, I mean, weird that in this day and age that hasn't happened before. And I know that it happens in the choreography world as well. There's a lot more male ballet choreographers than there are females. Well, perhaps there's a lot more who are given more opportunities than female choreographers, which the RNZB is trying to address as well. But I don't think I got brought onto that project because I was a woman. It's just because I knew Lachlan and had a relationship with him, and we worked well together.
I spoke to Elizabeth Kerr, who set up composing women's festivals in the 90s, which I think both Eve and Medi, you were involved with. I basically just wanted to know what the environment was like at the time for women and what were the drivers for her setting up those festivals. And what she said was that women just weren't getting their works performed, they weren't getting commissions, they weren't getting university jobs. The organisers of those festivals spoke to heaps of women around the country from all different backgrounds, all different styles of music, and there was a general lack of confidence among them. And I think all of you have referenced in some way that, you know, that confidence that men have and that women perhaps don't have. But it sounded to me like it was, from what Elizabeth said, it was particularly bad at that time. And they would say things like, I'm not a composer, I'm just a songwriter. And there was this real feeling that composers were dead white men, and that as a living woman, you couldn't be one. I wonder, first of all, whether Eve and Medi, you think that that is a accurate depiction of what it was like in the 90s. And then I want to know whether there's any kind of relevance to now or whether that world has disappeared.
Yes, that there was a real sort of surging feeling of sorority around that time with people like Elizabeth and Diana Marsh who set up those fantastic festivals. And it was a thrill, that first one in particular, partly because of the blend of people. I remember having a photo taken on the steps of the Civic Centre down in Wellington, and just seeing the mixture of Jenny McLeod, who'd been asked to stub out her cigarette and that kind of thing, and Gillian and me and Mire and Dorothy Buchanan, but people like Janet Roddick and the Brainchilds, and it was diverse, and it was a thrill because we were all brought together. Then there was this whole festival full of stuff. I remember at the time, no male would dare say something like, oh, well, I would have liked to have something, because there was cutting down of, I remember a specific case, a nameless woman said, we've had decades of your festivals. And I felt sorry for that male because he hadn't done anything wrong. He was trying to just be a composer like the rest of us. So we had the first one, second one, third one, and I think by the time we'd had the third one, there was a feeling that the point had been made, the numbers had been risen, the singer-songwriters had all come on board and thought, well, yeah, I'm a composer too, all that. And we didn't really need any more at the moment. Of course, as we know, the numbers, the ratio of male-female works being played isn't yet equal, but there are a hell of a lot more people redressing that. You know, orchestras, chamber groups, certain ones who've committed to the equal programming, so it has changed.
But I just remember being in the Wellington Town Hall and just having all these wahine there and, you know, just young and naive and not really clocking what that meant. I just took it for given, you know. Yeah, it could be timely to have another women's composing festival. And as wahine, we have to do that. We have to create our own sacred spaces. A lot of Māori women do that in terms of their arts with weaving. There's nothing wrong with creating a woman's space, a sacred space for creating. You know, we tend to kind of try and make things nice coconut ice for everyone else, and that takes a lot of energy. You know, should we be like Tani and just, you know, be very self-confident and make a move before you're even ready? But that's not what women need. Women feel like we need to have everything, all our ducks in line before we make our move. And perhaps that's because we've been so marginalised in a Western context that we feel that we're not of equal status. But I think with the rangatahi that are coming through now, there's definitely no gender barrier. In fact, it's kind of fluid, which I find very exciting. It's a new breed of humanity where Tane and Wahine they're embracing both sides of themselves. Te ira Wahine, te ira Tane. And it's a new world that's coming with our mokopuna, with our grandchildren. And I hope I'm around to see that.
Claire, I know you wrote a violin concerto called Stark, which was based on the dancer Frida Stark, and I understand you're wanting to work on a ballet, or are currently working on a ballet about her story. And is that political for you, telling her story?
I think, yes, I think her story is interesting from many angles. Her queerness being one of them, but also the examination of the social attitudes of the time towards lesbians in the 1930s and 40s in New Zealand, and how all that relates, the sort of interconnectedness of that in the Western art music world and the orchestra, which is part of the story. Her lover was the wife of the conductor of basically the APO at the time, and who was accused of her murder. So it's a great story, and I try and seek out when I'm given commissions, which is not that often because I'm always working collaboratively. I try and seek out queer narratives for them to make it easier for me to write the story and for me to be passionate about telling the story through music and to give people a way into the music. It's just how I like to work with a sort of story or a very, very strong theme. Yeah, so that is something I try and do with my music, is put queerness on a stage in places where it doesn't normally exist, in the sort of orchestral world, in the ballet world, especially female love stories have never been on a ballet stage internationally, not in a full-length production anyway, so I think Stark will be the first in the world of its kind, in a professional ballet company, in a national ballet company. Has been done in some more amateur groups.
What I would like to do is just ask all of you whether we still need to have these discussions on women or gender more widely in music, and can you foresee a time where we no longer need to have those discussions?
I live in hope. That's all I can say, and I personally would love more women or non-binary composers to get in touch with me and say, how can I learn from you? How can I help you? And I would love that. It doesn't really happen, and I wish it would, because I could do with the help, and I would love to raise up some new voices. So yeah, live in hope.
These discussions about what it's like as women and non-binary composers are still important to have, and I think it's also important that those discussions are reaching out to the further regions. As someone who comes from Dunedin, as you mentioned, was from a largely male faculty, looking up the chain at, for example, just the residency at my own university hasn't been held by women since 2005. So looking up at the possible futures for careers in composition, I think these discussions still need to be had, and reaching out to those regions. And I think as long as there's a gender pay gap and disproportionate amounts of emotional labour being done by women, these conversations will be relevant in music as well, because naturally those broader social gender issues seep into the music as well and will always be relevant.
I think it's important to have a woman's space and to have women's voices, and I think it will always be that way. In Indigenous societies, there was always a woman's space and a man's space. We need to offer each other and support each other. So if we can find opportunities to do that, great. But it doesn't define you.
The sense of the women's space, to me personally and culturally, isn't a thing. It isn't a thing. But I can objectively see what a wonderful and important construct that might be, but I've never had it. I guess for me, there's also, I've always loved a male energy. I've never wanted to put that down unless it's misplaced. There's a cliche view, which I've been guilty on this forum of putting forward, which is that they are all confident and all pushy, but that is not the case. So being in a mixed creative community is crucial for me. Having said that, working with Mere on a piece called Ho, I was reflecting on that before, and there was something about Mere's very femaleness that was essential to that particular work.
Tāwhiri mātea, hine nui te pō.
Ihlara McIndoe, Eve de Castro-Robinson, Mary Boynton and Claire Cowan, 4 New Zealand composers discussing what it's like being a woman in composition. It seems that we're broadly in agreement that keeping a conversation going about gender and composition is important, even if, like Eve, a composer doesn't particularly want to identify as a woman composer or work especially in that space. As Ihlara said, until we see true gender equality in wider society, we can be sure that there's an impact of gender imbalance in composition. And while reflecting that wahine Māori create a sacred space for creativity, Mary spoke about rangatahi who have a gender identity that's not male or female, like non-binary. Does that also have an impact on your experience in composition? Finally, Claire offered some practical support. She asked women and non-binary composers who would like to help her with her work to get in touch. This podcast was presented and produced for Sound Centre for New Zealand Music, Toi Te Arapuaru, by me, Rebecca Blundell, and Phil Brownlee is our sound engineer. Thank you for listening. Once again, my guests were Eve de Castro-Robinson, Claire Cowan, Mary Boynton and Ihlara McIndoe. We heard extracts from Claire Cowan's Ultraviolet, played by Amalia Hall, Callum Hall and Sarah Watkins. Gareth Farr's Ngā Hihi o Matariki, featuring Mary Boynton, played by the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Gemma New, who also conducted Ihlara McIndoe's Ephemeral Bounds, performed by the NZSO National Youth Orchestra. Claire Cowan's Killing the Witch from Hansel and Gretel, performed by the NZSO under Hamish McKeach, and Eve de Castro-Robinson's These Arms to Hold You, featuring the Lyrica Choir of Kelburn School, the NZSO and Kenneth Young. Lastly, we heard Mary Boynton on Ho, another piece by Eve de Castro-Robinson. To hear more about the composers and their works, and for more information about the music of Aotearoa New Zealand, go to the SOUNZ website, sounz.org.nz, that's SOUNZ. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Toi te arapuaru, SOUNZ.